For more, let's bring in Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, also currently president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. He joins us live from the Sunshine Coast, where looks to be another beautiful day. Mr. Rudd, great to see you. Thank you for talking to us, and hope you're keeping safe. First things first, where do you stand in terms of Australia opening its arms, opening its doors, including to, say, Hong Kongers who are already in country?
Well, I think there's a requirement here for us all to help out. The United Kingdom has done so. I think other governments are doing so. The Australian government measure, when you look at it in aggregate terms, is actually quite modest. Its simple measure is to allow effectively 10,000 Hong Kong students currently in Australia to apply to stay here, and then subsequently to apply for Australian permanent residency. So in the overall scheme of things, it's modest, and I think there'll be an expectation domestically and internationally on Prime Minister Morrison to do more.
How much more would you like to see him do?
Well, the key question is, in Hong Kong, how many people will be placed at risk as a consequence of the Hong Kong national security law? And secondly, what constitutes an appropriate level of international burden sharing to deal with that? I have commended in the past the actions of other governments in putting their shoulder to the wheel here, and my simple argument is the Australian government should be doing likewise. But I'm not privy to the current diplomatic negotiations, obviously, between governments, but I do believe there should be wide international burden sharing. And in context, the Australian measure so far is almost micro in scope.
Mr. Rudd, isn't there an element of double standards here when you consider Australia's immigration policy and the very harsh conditions that many refugees are detained in, and yet there seems to be quite a even-handed, and dare I say, open-minded view to welcome in Hong Kongers?
Well, historically, Australia has always proportionally taken a high proportion per capita of refugees from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees for settlement in Australia. Certainly when I was in office, we were the third largest recipient in the world. Now that has slid somewhat under the current Conservative government, but I think you need to put these things into context. Certain international crises emerge from time to time. We've seen that in relation to the Rohingya in the past, in the case of those who are currently languishing on the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And that actually requires international states to then put their shoulder to the wheel, including Australia. And in that context, in my judgment, Australia has not done enough. And so this crisis arises as well. But in context, as I said, the Australian historical attitude to refugee resettlement has been progressive by most international standards, although that has deteriorated in recent years.
And Mr. Rudd, how bad, broadly speaking, would you say Sino-Australian relationships are right now? And are we in a situation where the back and forth on the rhetoric could turn into real action? And I'm talking about the threat of a retaliatory tit-for-tat spiral.
Well, if 1 is perfection and 10 is disaster, we're probably somewhere in the vicinity of 7 to 8 at the moment. But I need to put that into context, and here I don't seek to defend Mr. Morrison's government, because there have been a number of examples of maladroit handling of the Australia-China relationship, which were avoidable errors as opposed to unavoidable problems. But putting into a wider context, I know very few governments in the world who are currently not going through structural difficulties, mounting structural difficulties in their relationship with China. I see this in Japan, I see it in Canada, I see it in the United Kingdom, I see it in India, I see it in many of China's traditionally strong trading partners and economic partners around the world. So Australia's not Robinson Crusoe here, but to answer your question directly, it is in probably the most difficult stage that I've seen it in my 35 or 40 years of observation, either as a scholar, or a diplomat, or as foreign minister, or as prime minister.
Let's go back to former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, who is still with us. And Mr. Rudd, we will get into the nitty-gritty of the Chinese currency and whether it's fundamentals or flows that will continue to dominate. But I did want to bring you up to speed with an AmCham Hong Kong survey. More than 75% of US firms in the territory are extremely concerned or somewhat concerned about the national security law. How do you feel about this? Do you think Hong Kong's status as a regional financial capital is at risk?
I do believe it's under challenge, and that's based on foreign corporations' reading of the actual text of the Hong Kong security law. The four areas of criminality concerning secession, concerning subversion, concerning foreign collaboration, and concerning so-called terrorism are drafted very broadly. And when you add to that the enhanced powers of the Chinese and Hong Kong prosecution authorities, police authorities, and the creation of a separate division of the Hong Kong courts on these questions, and then Article 38 on its extraterritorial application, I think all corporations are working through what does this mean for us. And let me tell you, it does represent a significant change from the past. The results from the AmCham survey do not surprise me.
Is there a perception now in foreign policy circles that Washington is treating Hong Kong effectively as if Beijing has annexed it? Can we go that far? And do you think US sanctions on the Chinese banks that operate there are going to be a reality?
Well, taking the second question first, that is literally the $6,000 question. When you look at the application of the the United States human rights and democracy law for Hong Kong and its application to China's new national security law, the $6,000 question is, what will the United States now do in terms of its concrete sanctions? Will they include financial sanctions? If so, what sort? And will they impact on individuals and officials? Now, the truth is, those of us who seek to follow these debates closely in Washington, we don't know. But this is the debate being had royally within the US administration at present. If the United States decides upon a robust set of financial sanctions measures, including those which would impact the link between the US dollar and the Hong Kong dollar, then I think all bets are off in terms of what Hong Kong's future is. So to answer your question about is the United States now viewing Hong Kong as an absorbed entity of the PRC for economic, financial and legal purposes or not, that is the debate which is being had in granular detail in Washington as we speak.
Mr. Rudd, you're a fluent Mandarin speaker. You have a very good inside track, I'm sure, of what goes on at policy level at the higher echelons of the leadership in China. What is the next move, and why is all this assertive behaviour, whether it's economically or whether it's militarily, happening now? And is the next risk potentially Taiwan?
Well, there's a lot packed into that question, my friend. I'll try and give it a couple of minutes, if that's okay. First of all, anyone who claims if they speak Chinese and they're a foreigner and a foreign barbarian like me that they understand what's going on in Chinese politics has either been drinking a lot or they're trying to pull one over the eyes and ears of their friends. Look, we try to understand what's going on. Some of us have been at this for 30 or 40 years in my case, and we try to discern what is actually unfolding. I think if you to try to look beyond the headlines of the moment and what's happening in the deep structure of China's relationship with the United States and surrounding countries, the bottom line is that Xi Jinping's foreign policy has changed from that of his predecessors since the end of 2013. I can point to a conference in December of that year when the Chinese leadership and the international policy establishment convened and decided that the old days of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, they were when China was a weaker power. Now that China has more power, we now intend to be much more assertive about our interests and values in the world. Now, following on from that, what happens is that if you prosecute that, both in strategic policy, economic policy, trade, investment, technology, human rights and the rest, There comes a point several years down the track when other countries start reacting against that new assertion because it's not the status quo ante, it's new. And if I'm trying to structurally understand or explain what therefore is happening, those, I think, are the underpinning dynamics in the US-China relationship, as well as that with Japan, Australia, and others. As for the future, Taiwan, I think the leadership in China always have a Beidaihe retreat in August. I'm not sure whether it's going to be physical or virtual this year. I assume it's going to be partly physical, in which case the number one question will be the future strategic nature of the US-China relationship and Taiwan within it. And we do not know the outcome, but things are hardening.
Mr. Rudd, you know, in answer to Parishree's question, a lot of people would say China has been not just assertive, but also opportunistic through this COVID crisis. But it's at the point where now they are in danger of a risk of what's known as Imperial Overreach or overstretch. Do you believe that to be true?
Well, analytically speaking, if you were sitting in Beijing's seat and looking at the world and the region, particularly in, let's call it, the 2020 environment, and you looked at the debacle of US domestic management of COVID-19 and the failure of the US to provide global leadership in response to what is a global public health and economic crisis, then it's very difficult sitting in Beijing not to identify a leadership vacuum and to walk right into it. And more broadly, under the Trump administration, when we've seen the United States basically walk away from many of its allies, criticize its allies, walk away from multiple multilateral institutions like the WTO, like the WHO, like the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and others. From Beijing's perspective, this represents an open door, and the Chinese, opportunistically or otherwise, have walked straight in. So I think that is part of what we see. On the question of overreach, I do believe, in answer to your question, that one of the deep questions and debates internally within Chinese domestic politics so far is, has China gone too far too early under Xi Jinping's leadership? And there are reservations about South China Sea, island reclamation. There are reservations about the cost and foreign policy impact of the Belt and Road Initiative. And there are reservations about elements of the handling of the COVID-19 crisis. And those who would criticize Xi Jinping's leadership internally are actually raising these arguments. Will they prevail or not? That's very much an open question. Xi Jinping is a master politician.
And we'll be watching. Mr. Rudd, fantastic talking to you. Always such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Keep safe, and we'll do it again very soon, I hope. Kevin Rudd there, former Prime Minister of Australia, joining us live now with the Asia Society Policy Institute.